The November wind cut through the Colorado mountains like a blade, carrying with it the promise of an early winter. Elias Turner pulled his worn and buffalo coat tighter around his shoulders as he made his way down the narrow trail, his boots crunching through the thin layer of frost that had settled overnight. The sun hung low behind the peaks, casting long shadows across the valley where his cabin sat. A solitary structure of weathered logs and determination. He'd built it himself, 15 years back, when the grief was still fresh enough to taste like copper in his mouth. Built it with hands that shook from more than just the cold, in a place so remote that even the most determined of visitors would think twice before making the journey. That was the point. A man didn't come to these mountains looking for company. The letter in his coat pocket crinkled as he moved, its presence as foreign as a cactus in snow. He'd picked it up from the general store in Silver Creek 3 days ago, along with his winter supplies. Old Morton had handed it over with raised eyebrows that asked questions Elias had no intention of answering. "From Denver," Morton had said, tapping the envelope. Fancy writing on it, too. Elias had merely grunted, shoving the letter away unread until he was well clear of town and prying eyes. Now, as he approached his cabin, smoke already rising from the chimney thanks to the banking he'd done that morning, he couldn't put off reading it any longer. The interior of the cabin was sparse but clean, a single room with a loft for sleeping, a stone fireplace that took up most of one wall, a rough-hewn table with 2 chairs he'd never needed, and shelves lined with preserves, dried meat, and the few books that kept him company through the long winters. Everything a man needed. Nothing more. He hung his coat on the peg by the door, set his rifle in its place beside the fireplace, and finally drew out the letter. The paper was fine, too fine for these parts, and the script was indeed fancy, all loops and flourishes that spoke of education and Eastern manners. Mr. Elias Turner. As per your inquiry through our mutual acquaintance, Mr. Samuel Morrison, we have arranged for a suitable governess cook to arrive at Silver Creek on the 15th of November. Miss Clara Hartley comes highly recommended for her domestic skills and discretion. She understands the isolated nature of your residence and is prepared for the challenges of frontier living. The agreed-upon sum of $40 monthly should be paid directly to Miss Hartley, who will manage her own expenses from this amount. She expects room and board as discussed, with appropriate arrangements for privacy and propriety. We trust this arrangement will prove satisfactory for the winter months ahead. Yours in service, Mrs. Adelaide Pemberton, Pemberton Domestic Agency. Denver. Elias stared at the letter, his jaw tightening. Samuel Morrison. He should have known that meddling fool would take his casual complaint about the difficulties of winter preparation and turn it into this. He'd mentioned, perhaps after one too many whiskeys, that the winters were getting harder to manage alone, that keeping the cabin warm, the animals fed, and himself properly nourished through the frozen months was becoming a challenge that gnawed at his bones. But he hadn't asked for a woman. Certainly hadn't asked for some Eastern governess with fancy manners and delicate sensibilities. What he'd had in mind was maybe a hired hand, some down-on-his-luck miner who could split wood and wouldn't expect conversation. The 15th. That was today. Elias crumpled the letter, then smoothed it out again. $40 a month was steep but not unreasonable. He had the money. Years of trapping and the occasional guide work had built up a decent sum, hidden in the coffee tin behind the loose stone in the fireplace. Money meant nothing up here anyway. Couldn't eat it or burn it for warmth. He moved to the window, peering out at the trail that led down to Silver Creek. It would take most of the day for someone to make the journey up, assuming they found someone willing to guide them. Assuming this Miss Hartley didn't take one look at the mountains and catch the next stage back to Denver. That would be best, he decided. He'd go down to town in a few days, explain there had been a misunderstanding, Morrison could mind his own business, and Elias could go back to his solitude. The cabin had been enough for him these 15 years. It would be enough for 15 more. But as the day wore on, Elias found himself making small preparations despite his resolution. He cleared the accumulated gear from the small lean-to room he used for storage, swept out the mouse droppings and dust. He checked the stove in there, a smaller thing he'd installed years ago, with some vague notion of eventually needing the space. It worked, though it smoked a bit. By afternoon, he'd brought in extra wood, filled the water barrels, and even taken the time to patch a hole in the roof of the lean-to where the wind had been whistling through. All practical things, he told himself. Things that needed doing anyway. The sun was beginning its descent behind the western peaks when he heard it, the distant sound of horses on the trail. Elias stepped out onto the porch, his breath misting in the cold air. Two figures on horseback were making their way up the final stretch. One clearly a local guide by the way he sat his horse. The other was bundled so thoroughly against the cold that Elias couldn't make out much beyond the fact that she was small and rode like someone who'd learned on eastern bridle paths rather than mountain trails. The guide, it looked like young Tom Bradley, was leading a pack mule loaded with what appeared to be luggage. Too much luggage for a winter's work. They reached the cabin as the last light was fading. Tom swung down from his horse with the easy grace of youth, then turned to help the woman dismount. She moved slowly, carefully, one hand pressed to her middle as she found her footing. "Mr. Turner," Tom called out, his voice carrying that nervous edge young men got around their elders. "Brought Miss Hartley up from town, like she asked." Elias remained on the porch, watching as the woman straightened, pulling back the hood of her traveling cloak. She was younger than he'd expected, perhaps 25, with dark hair pulled back in a simple knot and a face that might have been pretty if it weren't drawn with exhaustion. Her eyes, when they met his, were gray as the winter sky. And she was with child. The swell of her belly was unmistakable now that she stood facing him, her cloak falling open to reveal the clear evidence of pregnancy. Far along. By the look of it, months, not weeks. "You're Miss Hartley?" The words came out rougher than he'd intended. She lifted her chin, a gesture that spoke of pride despite her obvious weariness. "Mrs. Hartley," she corrected, her voice carrying a slight tremor that might have been from the cold. "I'm a widow." Tom was already unloading the pack mule, setting bags in a small trunk on the porch with hurried movements that suggested he wanted to be gone before full dark. Smart boy. The agency said nothing about... Elias gestured vaguely, his mind racing. "About my condition?" Clara Hartley's voice gained strength, though he could see her swaying slightly on her feet. "I informed Mrs. Pemberton. She assured me it would not be an issue, given that I would not require wages until after my confinement. After the baby will come whether you approve or not. Mr. Turner." There was steel in her voice now, despite her exhaustion. "I can work until my time, and after... I'm asking only for shelter and food in exchange for my labor. The arrangement stands as agreed." Tom cleared his throat, already back on his horse. "I'll be heading back now. Mr. Turner, gets dark quick on the trail." He tipped his hat to Clara. "Ma'am." And then he was gone, the sound of hooves fading into the gathering darkness, leaving Elias alone with a pregnant widow and the growing certainty that his carefully ordered world had just been upended. "I didn't pay for this," he said finally, the words harsh in the cold air. "I didn't pay to feed two..." Clara Hartley drew herself up straighter, though he could see the effort it cost her. Her hands moved protectively to her belly, but her eyes never left his face. "The baby will come whether you paid for it or not," she said quietly. "I can work, I will work, but if you're going to turn me out, do it now, while there's still light enough to walk back down the trail." The challenge hung between them in the frigid air. Elias could see her trembling, whether from cold or exhaustion or sheer determination, he couldn't say. The practical part of him, the part that had survived 15 winters alone, knew she'd never make it down the mountain in the dark. The trail was treacherous enough in daylight, and beneath that, buried deep where he tried not to look, was the memory of another woman standing in the snow, heavily pregnant, laughing as she threw snowballs at him while their son toddled between them on unsteady legs. "Get inside," he said gruffly, turning away. "The lean-to room has a stove. You'll freeze standing out here. He heard her pick up one of her bags, her movements slow and careful. When he glanced back, she was struggling with the weight, one hand supporting her belly while the other gripped the handle. Without a word, he stepped down and took the bag from her, then grabbed the trunk as well. She followed him into the cabin, and he was aware of how she paused in the doorway, taking in the sparse interior, the lonely table with its 2 chairs, the narrow space that had been home to only him for so many years. "Through here," he said, leading her to the lean-to room. It was small but clean now, with a narrow bed, the smoking stove, and a few hooks on the wall for clothing. "You'll take your meals in the main room. Privy's out back. There's a path." She nodded, setting down the small bag she still carried. "Thank you, Mr. Turner." He grunted, already backing toward the door. "Supper's at sundown." "You missed it today, but there's bread and cold meat on the shelf. Help yourself." "I can cook tomorrow," she offered quickly. "That's why I'm here. I'm a good cook. Mr. Turner. You won't regret." "We'll see." He cut her off, then paused in the doorway. "What happened to your husband?" Something shifted in her face, a closing off that he recognized. "He died," she said simply. 6 months ago. 6 months, and her far along enough that the child must have been conceived. He did the calculation and felt something twist in his chest. A widow indeed, carrying her dead husband's child, alone in the world and desperate enough to answer an advertisement for work in the middle of nowhere. "Get some rest," he said gruffly. "Work starts early here." He closed the door between them, leaving her to settle in, and moved to his chair by the fire. The flames crackled and spit, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the peaks with a sound like mourning. Elias Turner sat alone in his cabin that wasn't quite empty anymore, and wondered what in God's name he'd just done. The morning came early and cold, frost painting elaborate patterns on the cabin windows. Elias was already up, had been for an hour, stoking the fire and preparing for the day's work. He moved quietly out of habit, though he caught himself listening for sounds from the lean-to room. Nothing. The woman was either still asleep or lying awake in silence. He set the coffee pot on the stove and was slicing bacon when the door opened. Clara Hartley stood there, dressed in a plain brown dress and apron, her hair already pinned up neatly despite the early hour. The shadows under her eyes spoke of a restless night, but she moved with purpose. "I'll do that," she said, stepping toward the stove. "Coffee's nearly ready." He replied, not moving aside. "Bacon goes in the pan when it's hot enough to spit. I know how to cook bacon, Mr. Turner." There was no sharpness to her words, just a quiet statement of fact. He studied her for a moment, then stepped back, handing her the knife. She took his place at the stove with an economy of movement that spoke of long practice. Despite her condition, she worked efficiently, slicing the rest of the bacon, setting it to sizzle in the cast-iron pan, then reaching for the egg basket without being told where it was. "How many eggs?" she asked. "3. He paused. "4. You need to eat." She nodded, cracking eggs one-handed into a bowl while keeping an eye on the bacon. He noticed she held her other hand against her lower back, a gesture he remembered from before. They ate in silence, sitting across from each other at the table that had only known one place setting for 15 years. Clara ate steadily, but slowly, as if each bite required consideration. When she finished, she immediately began clearing the dishes. "I'll need to know your routine," she said, pumping water into the wash basin. "What time you prefer meals? What foods you favor? Any particulars about the household? Sunup, noon, sundown for meals. I'm not particular about food. Whatever keeps a man going." He pulled on his coat. "There's a root cellar out back. Smokehouse, too. Chickens in the coop need feeding. Eggs gathering. 2 milk goats in the shed." She nodded, hands deep in the soapy water. "Any washing that needs doing? I manage my own." "I see." She dried her hands on her apron, turning to face him. "And what would you have me do between meals? Mr. Turner, I'm here to work." He looked at her, this small woman with her swollen belly and tired eyes, standing straight-backed in his kitchen as if she weren't carrying a burden that would have sent most women to their beds. "Do what needs doing," he said finally. "Just don't overdo." Something flickered in her eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or relief. "I won't." He left then, escaping to the familiar world of outdoor chores. The animals needed tending. Wood needed splitting. The endless tasks that filled a man's days in the mountains. But he found himself working closer to the cabin than usual, keeping an ear out for what? Signs of distress? The crash of dishes? He didn't know. What he heard instead was singing, soft, almost under her breath, a melody he didn't recognize carrying on the thin mountain air. He paused in his wood splitting, axe raised, listening despite himself. The song stopped abruptly, as if she'd caught herself, and the silence that followed seemed heavier somehow. When he came in for the noon meal, the cabin had been transformed. Not dramatically. His few possessions remained where they'd always been, but the surfaces were clean, the windows cleared of their film of smoke and dust, and the whole place smelled of soap and something else. Fresh bread. Clara was pulling a loaf from the oven, her face flushed from the heat. "I hope you don't mind," she said without turning. "I noticed you had flour and starter." Seemed wasteful not to use it. The bread was perfect, golden crusted and steaming when she cut into it. She served it alongside a thick stew made from dried meat and root vegetables he hadn't even remembered he had. They ate in the same silence as breakfast, but it felt different somehow, less strained. "Where did you learn to cook?" he asked finally. She looked up, seeming surprised by the question. "My mother, mostly, then later." She paused, her hand moving unconsciously to her belly. "I kept house for the minister's family in town, before I married." "What town?" "Lawrence, in Kansas." He knew of Lawrence, had heard stories. "Rough place?" "Yes." The single word carried weight. They finished the meal without further conversation. She began clearing again, and this time he helped, carrying his own dishes to the wash basin. Their hands brushed as she took them from him, and she pulled back as if burned. "I can manage," she said quickly. He retreated to his chair by the fire, pulling out his knife and a piece of wood he'd been whittling. It was meant to be a deer, though it looked more like a misshapen dog at the moment. He worked at it while she moved about the cabin, aware of her presence in a way that made his hands clumsy. As the afternoon wore on, he noticed her movements becoming slower, her hand pressing more frequently to her back. When she reached for something on a high shelf and swayed slightly, he was on his feet before he thought about it. "Sit," he ordered, guiding her to the other chair by the fire. "Now." "I'm fine," she protested, but she sank into the chair with obvious relief. "When's your time?" The question came out more bluntly than he'd intended. She colored slightly. 2 months, perhaps a bit more. It's hard to know exactly. 2 months. Dead of winter. The nearest midwife was in Silver Creek. A day's journey in good weather. Impossible if the snows came heavy. "You have experience with birthing?" she asked quietly, reading his thoughts. "Cattle? Horses?" He paused. "Once, a long time ago." He didn't finish. "Couldn't," but she seemed to understand, nodding slowly. "I'll manage," she said, echoing her earlier words. "Women have been having babies in harder places than this. Not alone." "I'm not alone." She met his eyes steadily. "Am I, Mr. Turner?" He looked away first, uncomfortable with what he saw in her gaze. Trust, maybe, or hope. Both things he'd forgotten how to handle. The evening meal was simpler, cornbread and beans, with preserved peaches for after. She ate more this time. He noticed, some of the tension easing from her shoulders. When the dishes were done and the fire banked for the night, she paused at the door to her room. "Thank you," she said softly, "for letting me stay." He grunted, not trusting himself with words. After she'd gone, he sat by the dying fire and tried not to think about another woman, another time, another child on the way, Failed, as he always did. But tonight the memories seemed softer somehow, blurred at the edges like an old photograph. He was banking the fire when he noticed it. His spare coat, the one with the torn pocket he'd been meaning to mend, hanging on its peg. The pocket had been repaired with small, neat stitches, so careful they were almost invisible. Such a small thing. A pocket mended without asking, without fanfare, just something that needed doing. Done. Elias Turner stood in his cabin that smelled of bread and soap and the faint scent of another person, and felt the first crack in walls he'd built 15 years high. The next morning brought snow, fat flakes that fell steady and thick. Clara was up before him, the coffee already brewing when he emerged from the loft. She moved more carefully today. He noticed, but with the same quiet efficiency. "I'll need to bring in more wood," he said over breakfast. "Storm coming." She nodded. "I'll help." "You'll do no such thing. I can carry smaller pieces." "No." They stared at each other across the table, two stubborn souls testing boundaries. "Finally." She looked away. "Then I'll prepare the noon meal early, so you can eat warm when you come in." It was a compromise, of sorts. He spent the morning hauling wood, stacking it high against the cabin walls while the snow continued to fall. When he came in, half frozen and covered in white, she had hot soup waiting and a towel warming by the fire. "Your clothes are soaked," she observed. "They'll dry. They'll dry faster if you change first." She moved to the stove, deliberately turning her back. "I won't look." He changed quickly, hanging his wet things by the fire, uncomfortably aware of her presence even with her back turned. When he was done, she handed him the soup without comment, though he thought he caught the ghost of a smile. That evening, as the storm raged outside, she asked, "Do you have books?" He gestured to the shelf. "Help yourself." She chose a volume of poetry. Of all things, Wordsworth. He watched from the corner of his eye as she settled carefully in the chair across from him. The book balanced on what remained of her lap. The firelight caught in her dark hair, picking out threads of auburn he hadn't noticed before. They sat in companionable silence. The only sounds, the crackling fire and the wind howling outside. Sometimes she would shift, trying to find a comfortable position, and he pretended not to notice. Once, she dozed off, the book sliding from her fingers. He caught it before it hit the floor, marking her place with a scrap of leather before setting it on the table. She woke with a start. "I'm sorry, It's late," he said gruffly. "Get some rest." She rose carefully, one hand on the chair for balance. At her door, she paused again, looking back at him. "Good night, Mr. Turner. Elias." He heard himself say, "My name is Elias." She smiled then, a real smile that transformed her tired face. "Good night, Elias, I'm Clara." After she'd gone, he sat alone by the fire, whittling at his misshapen deer and trying not to think about how his name sounded in her voice. Outside, the snow continued to fall, blanketing the mountain in white, sealing them together in this small, warm space against the cold world beyond. For the first time in 15 years, the silence didn't feel quite so heavy. The snow had stopped by the third week, leaving the world outside wrapped in pristine white. Inside the cabin, a routine had developed, unspoken but understood. Clara rose early to start breakfast. Elias tended the animals. They ate together in comfortable silence, and the days passed in a rhythm as old as the mountains themselves. It was on such a morning, the air so cold it hurt to breathe, that Elias heard it. He'd come in quietly, not wanting to wake Clara if she'd slept late. The baby had been restless the night before. He could tell by how often she'd shifted and turned, but as he stood by the door, shaking snow from his boots, the sound reached him. Crying, soft, muffled, as if she were pressing her face into a pillow to muffle the sound. He stood frozen, one boot on, one off. The crying continued, punctuated by gasping breaths that spoke of deep grief, the kind that ambushed you when you thought you'd learn to live with it. Elias knew that kind of crying, had done his share of it those first months after. His instinct was to back away, To return to the barn and pretend he'd heard nothing. Let her have her privacy, her pain. Instead, he found himself moving to the stove, quietly filling the kettle. He worked in silence, brewing tea with the dried chamomile she'd found in his stores and organized with her careful hands. When it was ready, he poured a cup and added a precious spoonful of honey from his small supply. He didn't knock on her door, just set the cup on the floor outside it, along with 2 of the biscuits left from last night's supper. Then he added wood to both fires, making sure the cabin would stay warm, and returned to the barn. When he came back an hour later, the cup was gone. Clara was at the stove, her face composed, though her eyes were still red-rimmed. She didn't mention the tea, and neither did he. But that evening, his favorite shirt, the one with the frayed cuffs he'd been meaning to fix, appeared on his chair, mended with the same tiny, careful stitches as the coat pocket. 3 nights later, it happened again. This time, Elias was sitting by the fire, unable to sleep. The sound was quieter, but in the still night air, it carried. He rose, repeated his ritual with the tea, but this time he lingered by her door. "Clara?" His voice was rough from disuse. "You all right in there?" The crying stopped abruptly. For a long moment, there was silence. Then, so quiet, he almost missed it. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean to wake you. You didn't." He pressed his palm against the door, remembering another door, another woman crying on the other side, and how he'd been too wrapped in his own grief to comfort her. Do you want to talk?" Another long silence. Then the door opened a crack. Clara stood there in her nightdress and shawl, her hair in a long braid, looking younger and more vulnerable than he'd ever seen her. Her hand rested protectively on her belly. "I dream about him sometimes," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "My husband, Daniel, I dream he's still alive, that none of it happened. Then I wake up and remember." Elias nodded slowly. "How did he die?" She moved past him to the main room, settling carefully in the chair by the fire. He added another log, then took his own seat, waiting. "He was a printer," she began, staring into the flames. "Had his own small press in Lawrence. He believed in things, in justice, in truth, said it was a printer's duty to spread both." A bitter smile touched her lips. He printed pamphlets about the railroad companies, about how they were stealing land from farmers, forcing them out with false deeds and hired guns. Elias knew where this was going, had seen it play out in too many frontier towns. The railroad men came one night, said he had to stop printing his lies, or they'd stop him permanent. "Daniel," her voice caught. "Daniel told them the truth wasn't lies. They beat him right there in our shop, broke his presses, burned his papers. The sheriff arrested him for disturbing the peace. Can you imagine? They beat him half to death, and he was the one arrested." Her hands clenched in her lap. "He died in that jail cell 3 days later. Internal injuries, the doctor said, though he wouldn't put it in writing. I tried to get justice, tried to get anyone to listen. But the judge was in the railroad's pocket. The whole town was. They made it clear I should leave, made it very clear. So you answered an advertisement for a cook in the Colorado mountains." She looked up at him then, eyes bright with unshed tears. "I had nowhere else to go. My family disowned me when I married Daniel. He was beneath me. They said his family was all back east, and with the baby coming." She shrugged, a gesture of such profound helplessness that it made his chest tight. They sat in silence for a while, the fire crackling between them. Finally, Elias spoke. "My boy was 8. The words came hard, like pulling splinters from old wood. "Samuel, strong boy, smart, had his mother's eyes and her way of finding joy in everything. The fever came through in 67. Took half the valley. We thought we were safe up here, away from town. We weren't." He stared into the fire, seeing faces in the flames. "He went first. 3 days of burning up while we tried everything. Cold baths, willow bark tea, prayers I didn't even believe in. Nothing helped. Mary," she held him while he died, "wouldn't let go even after. Had to pry him from her arms to bury him." Clara made a soft sound of sympathy, but he couldn't look at her. She followed him a week later, same fever, but I think she just didn't want to fight it. Didn't want to stay in a world without him. His voice roughened. I buried them together, up on the ridge where the wildflowers grow in spring. Then I came back here and stopped. Stopped? Living, trying, caring about anything beyond surviving another day. 15 years of just stopping. The silence stretched between them, but it was different now. Not the careful silence of strangers, but the shared quiet of two people who understood that some pain was too deep for words. I talk to Daniel sometimes, Clara admitted softly. Tell him about the baby moving, about the mountains, about you. Is that foolish? No more foolish than a man who still sets 2 plates sometimes without thinking. She reached out then, her small hand covering his where it rested on the arm of his chair. Her touch was warm, alive, a reminder that not everything in the world was memory and ghost. We're a pair, aren't we? She said with a watery smile. 2 broken people hiding in the mountains. Maybe broken people can help each other heal, he said, the words surprising him as much as her. She squeezed his hand gently before withdrawing. Maybe they can. They sat together until the fire burned low, not speaking, not needing to. When Clara finally rose to return to her room, she paused. Thank you, Elias, for the tea, for listening, for understanding. He nodded, not trusting his voice. After she'd gone, he remained by the dying fire, feeling something shift inside him like ice beginning to thaw. For the first time in 15 years, he'd spoken their names aloud. Samuel, Mary. The words had hurt. Yes, but they'd also felt like releasing a breath he'd been holding too long. The next morning, Clara placed a small vase on the table. Just a jar. Really, filled with dried grasses and winter berries she must have gathered. Such a simple thing. But it changed the whole room somehow. Made it look like a place where people lived rather than just existed. I hope you don't mind, she said, suddenly uncertain. I thought... It's nice, he said gruffly. Mary used to do the same. Set a table without something growing on it was just a slab of wood. Clara smiled, and for the first time since she'd arrived, it reached her eyes. That afternoon, while she rested, she tired more easily now as her time approached. Elias climbed to the ridge. The snow was deep, the going hard, but he needed to make this journey. The graves were covered in white, the simple wooden markers he'd carved barely visible. He brushed them clean with careful hands. Got company down at the cabin, he said to the silence. A woman, Clara. She's having a hard time of it. Lost her husband like you lost me, I guess. Only she's got a baby coming. The wind whispered through the pines, and he could almost imagine it was Mary's voice, telling him it was all right, that it was time. I've been frozen, Mary, frozen solid since you left, but she's thawing me out, bit by bit. That okay with you? No answer came, but the wind gentled, and a shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds, warming his face. He took it as a sign. When he returned to the cabin, Clara had supper waiting, venison stew and fresh bread, the smell of home filling the air. She looked up as he entered, and something in his face must have shone, because she smiled that gentle smile of hers. Wash up, she said simply. Food's getting cold. He did, and as they ate together in the warmth of the cabin, Elias felt the strangest sensation. Not happiness, exactly. He wasn't sure he remembered what that felt like, but something close to it, something like the possibility of happiness, maybe, glimmering in the distance like spring glimpsing through winter snow. Outside, night fell over the mountains, deep and cold and full of stars. But inside, in the circle of firelight, 2 wounded souls sat together, sharing food and silence and the tentative beginnings of something neither quite dared to name. Not yet, but soon, perhaps. When the thaw was complete, the trader came in early December, his wagon wheels cutting deep ruts through the snow. Josiah Briggs was his name, a man who made his living bringing supplies to the isolated homesteads scattered through the mountains. Elias had dealt with him for years, an honest enough fellow, if prone to gossip. "Got your usual order?" Briggs called out as Elias approached. "Plus some extra flour and beans. Figured with the heavy snows coming, you might want to stock up." Elias nodded, beginning to unload the supplies. Through the cabin window, he could see Clara watching, staying inside as they'd agreed. No sense in inviting questions, but Briggs had sharp eyes. "Smoke's been coming steady from your chimney," he observed. "And that's fresh bread I smell, unless I'm mistaken. You finally learned to bake, Turner." "Man learns what he needs to," Elias replied curtly. Briggs grinned, showing tobacco-stained teeth. "Or maybe a man's got help. Heard tell in Silver Creek that a woman came up the mountain a few weeks back. Widow woman from Kansas." Elias continued unloading, saying nothing. "Clara Hartley, they said her name was." Briggs lowered his voice conspiratorially. "Also heard she left Kansas in a hurry. Some trouble with the law. Maybe her husband was one of those agitator types, stirring up problems with the railroad. Makes a body wonder what kind of woman." "That's enough." Elias's voice was quiet, but carried an edge that made Briggs step back. "You'll keep a civil tongue when speaking of anyone under my roof." Briggs raised his hands placatingly. "No offense meant. Turner, just passing along what I heard. Man's got a right to know who he's harboring." "A man's got a right to mind his own business." Elias hefted the last sack of flour. "What do I owe you?" They completed the transaction in tense silence. As Briggs prepared to leave, he couldn't resist one last comment. "You be careful. Turner, woman like that, with her history, might bring trouble to your door." Elias watched the trader disappear down the trail, unease settling in his stomach like a stone. He knew how quickly rumors spread in these isolated communities, how a whispered word could become gospel truth by the time it had passed through 3 tellings. When he entered the cabin, Clara was kneading dough, her movements sharp and agitated. "I heard," she said without looking up. "His voice carries—" "Briggs is a fool who'll spread his tales at every homestead between here and Silver Creek." She slammed the dough down harder than necessary. "I should have known, should have expected it. A woman can't escape her past, not even in the mountains." "Clara, they'll make me out to be some kind of criminal, won't they? Or worse, a troublemaker who got her husband killed with her wild ideas." Her voice broke. "As if I haven't asked myself 1,000 times if I could have stopped him. If I could have—" "Enough." Elias moved to the table, stilling her flour-covered hands with his own. "You're not responsible for what happened to your husband, and you're not responsible for what small-minded people choose to believe." She looked up at him, eyes swimming with tears. "You don't understand. In Kansas, after Daniel died, they said things, that I was a loose woman, that I'd driven him to it with my demands, that I—" She pulled her hands free, wrapping them around her belly. "They said I didn't even know whose child I carried." The cruelty of it hit Elias like a physical blow. "Clara, I know it's Daniel's baby," she said fiercely. "I know it. We were married 3 years, faithful to each other every day. But they made it sound so dirty, made me feel dirty." Without thinking, Elias pulled her against him, his arms wrapping carefully around her shaking form. She stiffened for a moment, then collapsed against his chest, sobbing as she hadn't even in those late-night hours when she thought he couldn't hear. "You're not dirty," he said roughly. "You're not any of the things they said. You're a good woman who loved her husband and got caught in circumstances beyond your control. Anyone who says different will answer to me." She cried harder at that, her tears soaking through his shirt. He held her, one hand awkwardly patting her back, remembering how Mary used to fit against him just like this. Different woman, different sorrow, but the need for comfort was the same. When her sobs finally quieted, she pulled back, embarrassed. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have—" "Nothing to be sorry for." He handed her his handkerchief. "Briggs won't be saying anything else. I'll make sure of it. You can't fight the whole world for me. Elias, watch me." The next week, Elias made the trip to Silver Creek. He told Clara he needed supplies, but they both knew the real reason. The town was busy with pre-Christmas preparations, folks hurrying about their business in the cold. More than a few eyes followed him as he made his way to the general store. Morton was behind the counter, and his expression grew wary as Elias approached. "Turner, didn't expect to see you back so soon. Need a few things." Elias placed his order, then added casually, "Heard Briggs has been telling tales about my household." Morton shifted uncomfortably. "You know how Josiah is. Man likes to talk. Man needs to learn when to keep his mouth shut." Elias leaned against the counter. "Mrs. Hartley is a respectable widow under my protection. Her husband died serving the truth, and she's carrying his child. Anyone who suggests otherwise is a liar and a coward." The store had gone quiet, other customers listening while pretending not to. "Now, Turner," Morton started, but Elias cut him off. "I've lived on that mountain 15 years without bothering anyone. Plan to live there 15 more the same way. But if I hear one more slanderous word about Mrs. Hartley, I'll take it personal. Very personal. Man can make a lot of trouble for folks who depend on mountain trade, if he's minded to." The threat was implicit, but clear. Elias controlled one of the best passes through the mountains, had guided many of these merchants' supply trains through difficult weather. His goodwill was valuable. Morton nodded quickly. "No offense meant. I'm sure I'll have a word with Josiah." "You do that." Elias completed his purchases and left, but not before stopping at several other establishments to make similar points. By the time he reached the small church at the edge of town, word had already spread. The minister, a young man named Reverend Davis, met him at the door. "Mr. Turner, I heard you've taken in the widow Hartley." "I have." "That's a Christian act. Sir, a woman in her condition needs protection and care." The Reverend's voice was carefully neutral, though some might question the propriety of the arrangement. Nothing improper about a woman cooking and keeping house in exchange for room and board. Of course not. Still, for the sake of her reputation. Her reputation is my concern, Reverend, as is her safety and that of her child. Any man who questions either will find me ready to defend both. The Reverend studied him for a long moment. "You're a good man, Mr. Turner. Better than you allow most to see. I'll make sure the congregation understands that Mrs. Hartley is under godly protection." Elias nodded curtly and left. The ride home was cold and long, but he felt a grim satisfaction. The talk wouldn't stop entirely. It never did in small communities starved for entertainment. But it would be more careful now, more circumspect. When he reached the cabin, Clara was waiting on the porch despite the cold, wrapped in shawls. "I was worried," she said simply. "No need." He dismounted, handing her a small package. "Got you something." She opened it carefully, revealing several skeins of soft yarn in blue and yellow. "Oh, Elias, figured you might want to make things for the baby." He busied himself with the horse, not looking at her. "Mary always said babies needed soft things." "Thank you." Her voice was thick with emotion. "For the yarn, for going to town, for standing up for me. It's nothing. It's everything." She touched his arm lightly. "Come inside. Supper's ready. And you must be frozen." That evening, as Clara knitted by the fire, her fingers working the yarn into what looked like a tiny cap, Elias felt the rightness of it. This was what a home should be. Warm light, useful work, companionship that didn't require constant words. "I want you to know," Clara said suddenly, not looking up from her knitting, "that I would never do anything to bring shame to your home. The talk, it bothers me for your sake more than mine. The talk doesn't matter. It does, though. You've built a life here, a reputation. I don't want to damage that." Elias set aside the harness he'd been mending. "Clara, look at me." She raised her eyes to his. "I had a reputation for being a hermit who'd as soon shoot a man as speak to him. If that's changed because I've shown basic human decency to a woman in need, then it needed changing." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You've brought life back to this cabin. Don't apologize for that." She smiled then, soft and wondering. "You're not the hard man you pretend to be. Elias Turner." Don't go spreading that around," he said gruffly. But he was fighting a smile of his own. They returned to their work, the clicking of her needles and the whisper of leather through his hands creating a peaceful rhythm. Outside, the wind howled with the promise of more snow, but inside their small circle of light, all was well. Later that week, another visitor came, Reverend Davis himself, making the difficult journey to offer his services. "Thought I'd check on you folks," he said, accepting Clara's offer of coffee gratefully. "And to let you know, Mrs. Hartley, that you'd be welcome at services, should the weather and your condition permit." Clara's eyes widened in surprise. That's very kind. Reverend?" "Christian charity isn't just words. Ma'am, it's actions, Mr. Turner here reminded some of us of that fact." They spoke for a while of inconsequential things. The weather, the coming Christmas season, news from town. Before he left, the Reverend offered a blessing over their home and the coming child. Clara wept quietly through it, and even Elias felt something ease in his chest. After the Reverend had gone, Clara turned to Elias. "You did this. You made him come here, made him accept me." "I spoke my mind in town. The Reverend did what his conscience told him." She studied him for a long moment, then rose carefully and kissed his cheek, a quick, soft brush of lips that left him stunned. "Thank you," she whispered, then retreated to her room before he could respond. Elias stood in his cabin, hand raised to his cheek where her lips had touched, feeling like a man waking from a long, cold dream. Outside, the mountain wind carried whispers of scandal and judgment, but inside these walls, something altogether different was growing. Something that had nothing to do with gossip and everything to do with the quiet courage of two damaged people choosing to care for each other despite the watching world. He banked the fire carefully that night, making sure the cabin would stay warm until morning. As he climbed to his loft, he heard Clara singing softly to her unborn child, a lullaby he remembered from long ago, from another woman, another time. But instead of pain, the memory brought only a gentle ache, like an old wound finally beginning to heal. March arrived with a vengeance, bringing storms that turned the world white and wild. The wind howled like a living thing, rattling the cabin windows and piling snow against the door until Elias had to dig them out each morning. Clara moved slowly now, her body heavy with the child that seemed determined to arrive in the worst weather possible. Elias had taken to sleeping in the main room, bedroll by the fire. He told himself it was to keep the flames going through the cold nights, but they both knew the truth. He wanted to be close if she needed help. More than once, he'd awakened to hear her moving restlessly, unable to find comfort in any position. "Can't be much longer," she said one morning, hands pressed to her lower back as she tried to work at the stove. "Sit," he ordered, taking the coffee pot from her hands. "I can manage breakfast." She sank into the chair gratefully. "I'm not an invalid. Elias." "No, but you're about to bring a child into the world in the middle of nowhere with no midwife." He cracked eggs into the pan more forcefully than necessary. "Least you can do is rest when you can." She watched him work, a small smile playing at her lips. "You've been reading that medical book again," he grunted, not denying it. He'd found the old volume tucked in a trunk, one of Mary's, saved from her father who'd been a doctor back east. The chapters on childbirth were worn now from his studying, though the words sometimes swam before his eyes, bringing back memories he'd rather forget. "It's different with humans than animals," Clara said gently. "More complicated." "I know that." He set a plate before her, noticing how little room she had left between belly and table. "But it's better than knowing nothing." That afternoon, while Clara napped, Elias made his preparations. He boiled water and set it aside in clean containers, sterilized his knife and scissors in flame, tore clean sheets into strips for binding, found the sewing kit in case of tearing that needed repair. His hands shook slightly as he worked, remembering another birth, another time. When everything had gone right until suddenly it hadn't. The cradle sat in the corner, covered with a sheet. He'd finished it the week before, working late into the nights when sleep wouldn't come. It was simple but sturdy, carved from pine with rounded edges safe for small hands. He'd even managed to work a small design into the headboard, a mountain peak with a rising sun. Hope, maybe, or just wishful thinking. When Clara saw it, she'd cried. "It's beautiful," she'd whispered, running her hands over the smooth wood. "The baby will love it." "It's just a cradle," he'd said gruffly, but her tears had warmed something deep inside him. Now, as another storm gathered strength outside, Elias checked his supplies once more. Everything was ready, everything except him. How did a man prepare to bring life into the world when he'd seen how quickly it could be snatched away? That night, the storm struck with full fury. The wind screamed around the cabin, and snow fell so thick he couldn't see the barn from the window. Clara sat by the fire, knitting with determined concentration, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way she paused occasionally to breathe through what must be early pains. "Tell me about your childhood," she said suddenly. Before everything. What was it like?" Elias settled in his chair, understanding her need for distraction. "Grew up in Ohio, farm country. My PA was a stern man, believed in hard work and harder discipline. Ma tried to soften him when she could." "Did you have brothers? Sisters?" "2 brothers, both older. They got the farm when Pa died. I got the wanderlust." He smiled slightly. "Always wanted to see the mountains? Read about them in books and couldn't imagine anything so grand? And were they? Grand. I mean, grander. First time I saw the Rockies. I knew I'd never go back east." He paused. Mary understood that. She was from Missouri, but she took to the mountains like she was born to them. Clara's needles stilled. "Tell me about her. Not the sad parts, the happy ones." It was harder than he'd expected, summoning those memories without the pain that usually accompanied them. But slowly, he found himself talking about Mary's laugh, how she'd insisted on planting flowers even though the growing season was so short, how she'd sung while she worked, terrible off-key renditions that made him smile, how she'd been brave in the face of isolation, finding joy in small things, a hawk circling overhead, the first green shoots of spring, the way morning light caught in the ice crystals on the windows. "She sounds wonderful," Clara said softly. She was. He met her eyes. "You remind me of her sometimes, not in looks, but in spirit, that strength that doesn't need to announce itself." Clara's breath caught, whether from his words or another pain. He couldn't tell, but she smiled through it. "That's the nicest thing anyone said to me in a long time." The storm worsened as the night wore on. By midnight, Clara couldn't hide the pains anymore. She paced the small space, pausing to grip the back of a chair when contractions hit. Elias timed them as the book had instructed, watching the clock with growing concern. "They're getting closer," she gasped after a particularly strong one. 4 minutes apart. He helped her to the bedroom, where he'd already prepared clean bedding. "It's time." Fear flickered in her eyes, the first real fear he'd seen from her. "What if something goes wrong? What if the baby—" "Nothing's going wrong." He gripped her shoulders gently. "You're strong, the baby's strong, and I'm not going anywhere. We'll get through this together." She nodded, gathering her courage like a cloak. Together. The hours that followed blurred into a haze of pain and purpose. Clara labored with the same quiet determination she brought to everything, only crying out when the pains became too much to bear silently. Elias stayed with her, letting her grip his hands until his fingers went numb, wiping her face with cool cloths, murmuring encouragement when she faltered. "I can't," she gasped at one point, exhausted and trembling. "I can't do this." "Yes, you can." He smoothed damp hair back from her forehead. "You're the strongest woman I know. Clara Hartley, you survived losing your husband, traveled alone to the mountains, made a home in a stranger's cabin. This is just one more mountain to climb." She laughed weakly through her tears. Easy for you to say. Nothing about this is easy, he admitted. But necessary things rarely are. As dawn approached, the storm finally beginning to ease. Clara's labor intensified. Elias could see the baby crowning, just as the book had described. His hands were steady now, all his focus narrowed to this moment, this task. Push, Clara, hard as you can. She bore down with a primal sound that raised the hair on his neck. Once, twice, and then a rush of fluid and blood, and suddenly a tiny, slippery form was in his hands. For one heart-stopping moment, the baby was still, silent, blue-tinged in the lamplight. No, not again, not this time. Elias acted on instinct, clearing the baby's mouth and nose as he'd done with countless calves and foals. The infant remained lifeless, and panic clawed at his throat. Then he remembered something from the book. Sometimes they needed help to start breathing. He turned the baby face down, supporting its chest with one hand, and gave a firm pat between the shoulder blades. Nothing. Another pat, harder this time, and suddenly, a cough, a sputter, and then the most beautiful sound in the world, a baby's angry cry. Loud and strong and absolutely alive. "It's a boy," he said, his voice cracking as he wrapped the squalling infant in clean cloth. A beautiful, healthy boy. Clara sobbed as he placed the baby on her chest, her hands coming up automatically to cradle him close. The infant's cries quieted at his mother's touch, and Elias watched, transfixed, as tiny fingers wrapped around one of Clara's. "He's perfect," she whispered. "Oh, Elias, he's perfect." Elias turned away, ostensibly to deal with the afterbirth and cleanup, but really to hide the tears streaming down his face. He'd done it. They'd done it, against all odds. In the middle of a storm with no help but each other. They'd brought this child safely into the world, when everything was clean and settled. Clara drowsing with the baby at her breast. Elias finally allowed himself to sit. His hands shook now, delayed reaction setting in. He'd delivered a baby. He'd saved a life, 2 lives. The weight of it, the joy of it, threatened to overwhelm him. Elias. Clara's voice was soft, exhausted but content. "What should we name him?" He moved closer, looking down at the tiny face, still red and wrinkled from his journey into the world. "That's for you to decide." "I'd like to call him Samuel," she said quietly. If that's all right with you. New life from old sorrow. Maybe a way of honoring what was while hoping for what might be." Elias's throat closed entirely. Samuel, his son's name on this new child, this miracle born of storm and struggle. He reached out with one trembling finger to touch the baby's downy head. "Samuel's a good name," he managed. "A strong name. Samuel Daniel Hartley." She looked up at him, eyes bright with tears and something else, something that looked like love. "Thank you, Elias, for everything. I couldn't have—" "Hush!" He smoothed the blanket around them both. "Rest now. You've earned it." As mother and child slept, Elias kept watch. Outside, the storm had blown itself out, leaving the world pristine and new under fresh snow. Inside, the fire crackled warmly, casting dancing shadows on the walls. And in the bed, 2 lives that had depended on him slept peacefully, trustingly. He thought of Mary and young Samuel, buried on the ridge above. Thought of all the years he'd spent running from the risk of caring again, of opening himself to the possibility of loss. But looking at Clara and her son, their son, in all ways that mattered now, he knew the running was over. Life was risk. Love was risk. But the alternative, the cold, empty years he'd spent merely existing, that wasn't life at all. Clara had taught him that. This tiny baby, drawing his first breaths in a mountain cabin, had taught him that. Elias Turner bowed his head and wept, for grief finally released, for joy unexpected, for the grace of second chances he'd never thought to receive. And when his tears were spent, he built up the fire, checked on his new family once more, and settled in to watch over them as the sun rose on a changed world. Spring came slowly to the mountains, fighting winter for every inch of ground. By the time the snow began its reluctant retreat, Samuel was 6 weeks old and ruling the cabin with tiny fists and powerful lungs. He was a good baby, all things considered, but he had his moments, usually in the deep of night when both adults were exhausted. On this particular morning, Elias found Clara asleep in the rocking chair. Samuel finally quiet in her arms after a difficult night. She'd fallen asleep mid-lullaby, her head tilted at an angle that would leave her with a sore neck. Carefully, gently, Elias lifted the baby from her arms. Samuel stirred, his face scrunching in preparation for a cry, but Elias bounced him slightly. Making a low shushing sound he remembered from before. The baby settled, tiny fingers grasping at Elias's shirt. "Let your mama sleep," he whispered. "She was up with you half the night, little man." He carried Samuel to the window, showing him the world beyond the glass. "See that? That's the sun coming over the peaks. And those dark spots on the hillside? That's Earth showing through, means spring's really coming. Your first spring." The baby's dark eyes, Clara's eyes, seemed to focus on his face, though Elias knew it was probably too early for real recognition. Still, he kept talking, nonsense mostly, about the ranch work that needed doing, the vegetables they'd plant in the garden, the life that waited for them all when the world warmed. "Going to teach you everything," he found himself promising. How to track, how to read the weather, how to respect the mountains, how to be a good man, like your papa was, from what your mama says. His papa would have loved to hear that. Elias turned to find Clara watching them, a soft smile on her face despite her exhaustion. "Didn't mean to wake you." "You didn't. The quiet did." She stood, stretching carefully. "I can take him." "He's fine where he is." Elias shifted the baby to his shoulder, patting the small back automatically. "You need food and proper rest. In a bed, not a chair." She didn't argue, which told him how tired she truly was. As she moved toward the kitchen, he noticed her wince slightly. She was healing well from the birth, but 6 weeks wasn't long, especially with the demands of a newborn. "I've been thinking," he said, still swaying with Samuel. "Come full spring, we should go to town. All of us. Get supplies. Let the Reverend properly bless Samuel. Maybe—" He paused, suddenly uncertain. "Maybe have a meal at the hotel, like a family would." Clara's hands stilled in their preparation of breakfast. "A family? That's what we are, aren't we?" The words came out rougher than intended. "Maybe not in the conventional way, but yes." She turned to face him, eyes bright. "Yes, that's what we are." They held each other's gaze for a long moment, Samuel cooing between them, before Clara returned to her cooking with a smile that transformed her tired face. That afternoon, while Clara napped with the baby, Elias worked on something he'd been planning since Samuel's birth. In the barn, hidden under a tarp, was a cradle he'd modified with rockers that could be locked in place, turning it into a small sled. Come winter, they could pull Samuel through the snow, bundled warm and safe, but it was the other project that occupied him now. A simple wooden toy, a horse carved from pine. He'd started it the night after Samuel was born, working on it whenever he had a spare moment. It wasn't fancy, nothing like the toys wealthy children had, but he smoothed each curve with care, making sure there were no splinters to harm tiny hands. He was adding the final touches when he heard laughter from the cabin. Clara's laugh, bright and unexpected, followed by what sounded almost like an answering gurgle from Samuel. Elias set down his knife and moved to the doorway of the barn, watching as Clara held the baby up in the air, making faces that drew more of those almost laughs from her son. The sight hit him like a physical blow, not from pain, but from the sheer rightness of it. This was what the cabin had been missing all those lonely years. Not just people to fill the space, but life, joy. The sound of laughter that wasn't echoing from memory, but happening right now, right here. "Going to stand there all day?" Clara called, catching sight of him. "Or are you going to come meet your son? He's trying to smile. I swear he is." "Your son." The words should have hurt, should have reminded him that Samuel wasn't truly his. Instead, they felt like a gift. He crossed the yard in quick strides, arriving just as Samuel's face scrunched into what might generously be called a smile. "See," Clara said triumphantly. "He knows you." Elias reached out, letting Samuel grab his finger with surprising strength. "Course he does. I'm the one who caught him when he came into this world." "Caught him?" Clara laughed again. "You make it sound like he fell from the sky." "Felt like it at the time," Elias admitted. "One moment nothing, the next moment everything changed." She looked at him with those perceptive gray eyes. "Yes," she said softly. "Everything did." As the weeks passed and true spring arrived, changes came quickly. The snow melted, revealing the garden plot Clara had planned all winter. Elias turned the soil while she directed from the porch, Samuel in a sling across her chest. "Beans there," she instructed. "And squash along the fence. It'll climb. Oh, and we need herbs near the kitchen door." "You sure you weren't a farmer's daughter?" he asked, wiping sweat from his brow. "Minister's daughter," she corrected. "But we had a garden. Mama said idle hands were the devil's playground. So she kept us busy." They worked together through the warming days, establishing routines that felt as natural as breathing. Elias would rise early, tend the animals, then return to find breakfast ready, and Samuel usually awake and demanding attention. Clara managed the household with quiet efficiency, but now she hummed while she worked, and the sound filled the cabin like sunshine. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the peaks gold and pink, Clara said suddenly, "I've been thinking about what you said, about going to town as a family." Elias tensed slightly. They'd avoided the topic since that morning, both perhaps afraid to examine it too closely. "People will talk," she continued. "They'll see us together with Samuel and make assumptions." "Let them assume. It could complicate things. For you, your reputation, I told you before, I don't care about that." She shifted Samuel in her arms, gathering courage. "What if we made their assumptions true?" Elias went very still. "Clara, I'm not saying. I know this isn't a love match. I know you still mourn Mary, and I still—" She took a breath. "But we work well together. We're raising Samuel together. Maybe we could make it official. For his sake. For propriety's sake. Is that what you want? A marriage of convenience?" She was quiet for a long moment. "I want Samuel to have a father, a real father, not just in practice, but in name. I want to not worry about someone trying to take him from me because I'm an unwed mother. I want—" Her voice dropped to a whisper. "I want to belong somewhere. To someone. Even if it's just on paper." Elias reached over, taking her free hand in his. It was work-roughened now, no longer the soft hand of a town woman. "It wouldn't be just on paper," he said quietly. "Not for me. I can't promise romance or pretty words, but I can promise to care for you both, provide for you, protect you, be a father to Samuel in all ways, be a husband to you in whatever ways you'd want." Clara's fingers tightened on his. "You've already been those things. The paper would just make it official. Is that enough for you?" She looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw something in her eyes that made his heart skip. "Yes," she said simply. "It's more than enough." They were married 3 weeks later in Silver Creek, Reverend Davis performing the ceremony in the small church. Clara wore her best dress, a deep blue that brought out her eyes, and had woven early wildflowers into her hair. Elias wore his Sunday clothes, stiff with disuse, but clean. Samuel, in the little gown Clara had sewn, slept through most of the ceremony, only waking to voice his opinion during the final blessing. The congregation was small, a few townspeople who'd grown friendlier since Elias's winter visit. Josiah Briggs looking somewhat shamefaced in the back row, and old Morton from the general store. But it was enough. More than enough. "Do you, Elias Turner, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Reverend Davis asked. "I do." The words came strong and clear. "Do you, Clara Hartley, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do." Her voice trembled slightly, but her eyes were steady on his. "Then, by the power vested in me, I pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss your bride." Elias leaned down, intending a brief, ceremonial touch of lips, but Clara surprised him, rising on her toes to meet him halfway, her free hand coming up to cup his cheek. The kiss was gentle but real, holding promise and hope, and something that might, given time, grow into the love they both deserved. When they parted, Samuel chose that moment to let out a happy shriek, causing the small congregation to laugh. Clara colored prettily while Elias found himself grinning wider than he had in years. "Seems the boy approves," Morton called out, and more laughter followed. They spent their wedding night at the hotel, a luxury Elias had insisted on. Clara protested the expense, but he'd seen the wonder in her eyes at the simple pleasure of a hot bath and a soft bed she didn't have to make herself. "This is too much," she said, standing at the window of their room, Samuel sleeping in the drawer they'd padded with blankets to make a temporary cradle. Elias moved to stand behind her, not quite touching but close enough to feel her warmth. "Nothing's too much for my wife." She leaned back against him then, a gesture of trust that moved him deeply. "Your wife," she repeated softly. "I like the sound of that." "So do I," he admitted, wrapping his arms carefully around her. "So do I." They stood together, looking out at the town below, the mountains beyond, the life they were building one careful day at a time. It wasn't the marriage either of them had imagined in their youth, born of necessity rather than courtship, shadowed by loss and complicated by a child who carried another man's blood. But as Clara turned in his arms, reaching up to touch his face with gentle fingers, Elias thought it might be something better, a partnership forged in understanding, strengthened by shared purpose, and warmed by a growing affection that surprised them both. "No regrets?" she asked. He thought of the empty years behind him, the full ones ahead, and shook his head. Not one. And when Samuel woke demanding attention, they tended to him together, their son now in every way that mattered, the living symbol of their unexpected family, their improbable grace. The trouble came in late autumn, when Samuel was 7 months old and already trying to crawl. Elias had noticed the man watching their cabin from the ridge 2 days running, too far to make out features, but close enough to be worrying. On the 3rd day, the watcher descended. He was a government man. That much was clear from his Eastern clothes and official bearing, thin as a rake, with sharp eyes that took in everything and gave nothing back. He introduced himself as Mr. Theodore Hutchins from the Territorial Office of Family Welfare. "Might I come in?" he asked, though it wasn't really a question. Clara had gone pale at his introduction, clutching Samuel tighter. Elias stepped partially in front of them, a subtle shield. "State your business first." "There have been concerns raised about the welfare of a child in your care. I'm here to investigate the legitimacy of your household arrangement." "We're married," Elias said flatly. "Legal and proper. Reverend Davis performed the ceremony in Silver Creek this past spring." Hutchins produced a small notebook. "Yes, I've spoken with Reverend Davis. A lovely ceremony. He said, though rather hasty, considering Mrs. Turner here was already with child when she arrived at your homestead." Clara's chin lifted. "My first husband died before Samuel was born. Mr. Turner took us in out of Christian charity, and we married after a convenient interval." Hutchins' smile was thin. "Mrs. Turner, or should I say, Mrs. Hartley. There are those who question whether this marriage is genuine or simply an arrangement to avoid scandal." "What business is it of theirs?" Elias growled. "The territory takes the welfare of children seriously. Mr. Turner, a child born out of wedlock, raised in an irregular household." "There's nothing irregular about our household," Clara said, finding her voice. "We're a family." Hutchins made a note. "May I see the child?" They had no choice but to comply. Hutchins examined Samuel with clinical detachment, noting his healthy appearance, clean clothes, and obvious good care. The baby, picking up on the tension, began to fuss. "He needs to nurse," Clara said pointedly. "Of course." Hutchins stood. "I'll need to inspect the premises as well. Standard procedure." Elias showed him through the cabin, biting back anger at every invasive question. Yes, Clara had her own room. Yes, they maintained proprieties. The lie tasted bitter, considering Clara had moved into his bed on their wedding night and hadn't left since. But some truths weren't for government men. 2 weeks, Hutchins said finally, standing at the door. "I'll return in 2 weeks for my final assessment. I suggest you use that time to consider whether this arrangement truly serves the child's best interests. There are good Christian families in Denver who would be happy to provide a proper home for an infant." After he left, Clara sank into a chair, shaking. "They want to take him. They want to take my baby over my dead body." Elias knelt beside her, covering her trembling hands with his. "No one's taking Samuel, no one. But what if they decide we're not, that I'm not? Then we'll make it so clear that even a blind man could see we're a real family." He stood, pacing. 2 weeks. We have 2 weeks to prove that this marriage is more than paper. Clara looked up at him, tears streaming. "How?" He stopped pacing, an idea forming. "We do it right this time. A real wedding, not just a legal one. Here, on our land, with witnesses from town. We show them what everyone needs to see, that this is a love match, not convenience. But it started as convenience," she whispered. Elias crossed to her, cupping her face gently. "Did it? Or did it start with 2 lonely people finding each other when they needed it most? Clara, He struggled for words he'd never thought to say again. "I care for you, more than care. These months, watching you with Samuel, working beside you, sharing our days, I don't want to lose that. Either of you. Elias." Her voice broke on his name. "I'm not good with words. Never have been. But I know what I feel when I wake up beside you. Know what I feel when I see you singing to our son. It might not be the young love I had with Mary, all fire and passion. But it's real, and it's deep, and it's ours." She rose then, Samuel still in her arms, and leaned into him. "I love you too," she said simply. "I didn't expect to, didn't think I could after Daniel, but somewhere between the first snow and spring planting, you became everything." He kissed her then, careful of the baby between them, pouring into it all the words he couldn't say. When they parted, Samuel was grinning his 2-toothed grin, patting both their faces with chubby hands. "So, we do this proper," Clara said. "Show them all." The next morning, Elias rode to Silver Creek. He spoke with Reverend Davis first, explaining the situation. The Reverend's face darkened with anger, not at them, but at the interference. "Theodore Hutchins is a small man with large ambitions," he said. "He's made trouble before, always claiming to protect children while building his reputation. We'll give him a wedding he can't argue with." Word spread quickly. By the time Elias reached the general store, Morton was already planning the celebration. "My Martha's been itching to organize something since your quiet ceremony. This'll give her the excuse." Even Josiah Briggs, chastened by community opinion, offered to bring supplies up the mountain free of charge. "Least I can do," he mumbled, not meeting Elias's eyes. By week's end, the preparations were in full swing. Women from town made the journey up to help Clara with her dress, a proper wedding gown borrowed and altered to fit. They brought cake layers carefully packed, ribbons for decorating, and enough food to feed half the territory. "This is too much," Clara protested as Martha Morton pinned the dress. "We can't accept all this." "Nonsense," Martha said around a mouthful of pins. "You're one of us now. Have been since Elias stood up in my store and declared it. This is what neighbors do." The morning of the ceremony, exactly 13 days after Hutchins's visit, dawned clear and cold. Snow from an early storm dusted the ground, making the world pristine and new. The cabin had been transformed with pine boughs and ribbons, and the yard was full of townspeople who'd made the trek up the mountain. Elias stood before the cabin in his best clothes, now properly fitted thanks to Martha's quick needle. Reverend Davis waited beside him, prayer book in hand. The gathering crowd fell silent as the cabin door opened. Clara emerged like something from a dream. The borrowed dress had been made beautiful with her touches, embroidery at the cuffs and collar, her mother's lace at the throat. But it was her face that stopped his heart, radiant with joy and certainty. Martha Morton carried Samuel, who wore a tiny suit that had half the women cooing. As Clara reached him, taking his hands, Elias found himself speaking the words he'd prepared in the dark hours of the night. "Clara Turner," he said, loud enough for all to hear, especially the government man standing at the edge of the crowd. "You came to me in winter, when my world was frozen and dark. You brought warmth I'd forgotten existed. You gave me purpose when I'd settled for mere survival. You showed me that a heart could break and still learn to love again." He pulled out the ring, not the simple band from their first ceremony, but his mother's ring, silver worn smooth with age, now engraved with new words. "Grace given. I choose you," he continued, sliding the ring onto her finger. "Not from convenience or necessity, but from love. I choose you as my wife, my partner, the mother of my children, all the children God might bless us with. I choose you today and every day hence, in sight of these witnesses and the mountains that shelter us." Clara was crying openly now, not caring who saw. "Elias Turner," she managed, her voice carrying clear in the mountain air. "You gave me sanctuary when the world turned cruel. You caught my son when he entered this world and claimed him as your own. You showed me that strength could be gentle and silence could be full of love. You are my husband, not just in law, but in my heart. My protector, not just in deed, but in spirit." She produced her own gift, a simple gold band she must have traded for in town. Inside, engraved so small he'd need spectacles to read it, were 3 words: "Faith made whole." "I choose you," she said, placing the ring on his finger. "Today, tomorrow, and all the days God grants us. You are my husband, my love, the father of my son and all our future children. This I swear before these witnesses. We are a true family, bound by choice and love and grace." Reverend Davis cleared his throat, visibly moved. "Well then, by the power vested in me again, I pronounce you husband and wife in the eyes of God and man. What the Lord has joined, let no man tear asunder. You may kiss your bride, Elias." This kiss was nothing like their first ceremonial touch. This was a claiming, a promise, a declaration that rang truer than any words. The crowd erupted in cheers, and somewhere in the noise, Samuel's delighted shriek rose above all. As they turned to face their community, Elias caught sight of Hutchins, notebook forgotten in his hand, looking somewhat stunned. Martha Morton marched up to him, Samuel on her hip. "I trust you've seen enough, Mr. Hutchins," she said crisply. "Or shall we have them repeat their vows a 3rd time for your benefit?" The government man had the grace to look embarrassed. "That won't be necessary. It's clear that this is a genuine family arrangement." "More than genuine," old Morton added, joining his wife. "This here's what love looks like when it's been tested by fire and come out stronger. You put that in your report." As the celebration continued around them, music starting up, food being served, neighbors offering congratulations, Clara leaned into Elias's side. "Think we convinced him?" she asked. "Don't care if we did or didn't," he replied, pressing a kiss to her temple. "We convinced each other. That's what matters." She smiled, reaching up to touch the silver ring that now graced her finger alongside the simple band from their first wedding. "Grace given indeed, and received," he added, watching Samuel bounce in Martha's arms, reaching for them with chubby hands, and multiplied. The government man left before the dancing started, his official business clearly concluded. But the celebration continued until the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold, and when the last wagon rolled down the mountain path, Elias and Clara stood together on their porch, Samuel sleeping in his father's arms, watching the stars emerge in the clear winter sky. "No more questions," Clara said softly. "No more doubts. We're a family, legal and true, in every way that matters." "We always were," Elias replied. "Just took some folks longer to see it." She laughed, the sound carrying on the cold air like music. "Then here's to slow learners and second chances, and to grace," he added. "However it finds us." They went inside then, to their warm cabin filled with the remnants of celebration, flowers and ribbons and the sweet smell of wedding cake. But more than that, filled with the certainty of belonging, the security of recognized love, and the promise of all the years to come. A year had passed since the second wedding, and the cabin that had once echoed with loneliness now rang with life. Samuel, steady on his feet at 19 months, toddled after Elias with determination, mimicking his every move with a solemn concentration. "Pa, Pa," he called, his vocabulary still limited but enthusiasm boundless. "Up!" Elias scooped him up, settling the boy on his shoulders. "Hold tight, Sam. We're checking the fence line." From the garden, Clara straightened, one hand pressed to her back, the other shading her eyes. The morning sun caught the auburn threads in her dark hair, now grown long enough to pin up in the elaborate style she favored for special occasions. Today wasn't special, just washing day, but she looked beautiful anyway in her simple calico dress and flour-dusted apron. "Don't keep him out too long," she called. "And mind his hat. The sun's getting strong." Elias waved acknowledgement, adjusting the little straw hat Clara had woven for their son. As they walked the property line, he found himself talking to Samuel as he always did, pointing out tracks in the mud, explaining the signs of coming weather, sharing the knowledge that would one day make him a true mountain man. "See that? Deer tracks. Probably the doe that's been eyeing your mama's lettuce. And there, that's where the creek's running high from snowmelt. Always respect the water. Sam, it gives life, but it can take it too." Samuel babbled responses, occasionally offering a clear word, deer or water, that made Elias's chest swell with pride. His son, not by blood, maybe, but by choice and love and every day spent together. When they returned, Clara had lunch waiting and news to share. "Letter from Martha Morton," she said, sliding the envelope across the table. "The church is organizing a harvest festival. They want us to come." Elias scanned the invitation while Samuel attacked his mashed vegetables with more enthusiasm than accuracy. "That's 6 weeks away." "I know." Clara's voice carried an odd note. "I was thinking, maybe we could bring something special. Those preserves I've been working on, and—" She paused, color rising in her cheeks. "And we could share our news." He looked up sharply. "News?" She placed a hand on her still flat stomach, smile blooming across her face. "I'm fairly certain. I've been sick in the mornings, and I haven't— that is, my monthly time is late. I think come spring, Samuel will have a brother or sister." Elias stood so abruptly, his chair scraped against the floor. In 2 strides, he was around the table, pulling her carefully into his arms. "You're sure?" "As sure as I can be without a doctor." She laughed against his chest. "Are you happy?" "Happy?" He pulled back to look at her face. "Clara, I don't have words." "That's all right," she said softly. "I can see it in your eyes." Samuel, not to be left out, raised his arms, demanding attention. "Up, Mama, up!" Clara lifted him, settling him on her hip with practiced ease. "What do you think, little man, ready to be a big brother?" The boy's response was to pat her cheek with a sticky hand, leaving sweet potato in his wake. They laughed together, the 3 of them in their sun-drenched kitchen. A perfect moment in an imperfect world. The weeks that followed brought the full glory of mountain autumn. Aspens turned gold on the hillsides, their leaves shimmering like coins in the breeze. The garden produced its final bounty, squash and beans and root vegetables to be stored for winter. Clara worked tirelessly, preserving and canning, her movements careful but determined despite the fatigue of early pregnancy. "You're doing too much." Elias fretted. finding her one afternoon standing on a stool to reach high shelves. "I'm pregnant, not invalid," she retorted, but she let him help her down. "Besides, I want everything perfect for the festival. Our first real social event as a family." He understood. This wasn't just about preserves and pies. This was about cementing their place in the community, showing everyone that the questionable widow and the hermit mountain man had become something altogether different, a family that belonged. The morning of the festival dawned crisp and bright. They loaded the wagon carefully, Clara's preserves packed in straw, 2 pies wrapped in clean cloth, and Samuel's new outfit, sewn by Clara from fabric she'd traded eggs for, laid out carefully. The trip to Silver Creek took most of the day, with stops to rest the horses and let Samuel run off energy. As they approached the town, Clara smoothed her dress nervously. "Do I look all right? I'm showing a bit, and I wanted to wait until we were there to announce—" "You look beautiful," Elias interrupted. "You always do," she smiled, some tension easing. "You're biased. Completely." He agreed, making her laugh. The church grounds were already bustling when they arrived. Tables groaned under the weight of harvest bounty. Children ran between the booths, and the sound of fiddle music carried on the air. Several people called out greetings as they pulled up, and young Tom Bradley, not so young anymore, came to help unload. "Good to see you, Mr. Turner, Mrs. Turner," he said, tipping his hat. "And look at Samuel, walking and everything." The boy, suddenly shy, hid behind Clara's skirts, but within minutes, lured by other children and the promise of candy apples, he was toddling off under the watchful eyes of the church ladies. The afternoon passed in a blur of conversations, shared meals, and unexpected warmth. The same people who had whispered about Clara 2 years ago now sought her recipes and advice. Elias found himself drawn into discussions about weather patterns and crop yields. His isolation finally and completely ended. It was Martha Morton who noticed first, her sharp eyes catching what Clara had tried to hide. "My dear," she said quietly, pulling Clara aside. "Do I spy a blessing on the way?" Clara's hand went instinctively to her stomach. "We haven't announced it yet." "Then let's, shall we?" "Oh, this calls for a toast." Before Clara could protest, Martha was climbing onto a makeshift platform, spoon ringing against a glass. "Attention, everyone! I've just learned the most wonderful news." The crowd quieted, turning toward them. Elias moved to Clara's side, arms sliding around her waist in support. "Our dear Clara and Elias Turner are expecting an addition to their family," Martha announced. "A playmate for little Samuel come spring." The cheer that went up could probably be heard in the next county. People pressed forward with congratulations, and Clara found herself embraced by women who shared advice and promises of help. Even Josiah Briggs, fully reformed, shook Elias's hand with genuine warmth. "Building a real dynasty up there on the mountain," he said. "Good for you, Turner. Good for you both." As the sun began to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Reverend Davis called for attention. "Before we end this blessed day, I'd like to say a few words." The crowd gathered, children corralled by parents, conversations dying to respectful silence. 2 years ago, the Reverend began, a stranger came to our mountains, a woman in need, carrying a child, seeking shelter and work. She found both in the cabin of a man we'd all written off as lost to grief and solitude. Elias shifted uncomfortably, but Clara squeezed his hand, keeping him in place. What followed, Davis continued, was nothing short of a miracle. Not the flashy kind with angels and trumpets, but the quiet kind. The kind where 2 broken people help each other heal, where a lonely cabin becomes a home, where a child born to sorrow finds a father who chose him with deliberate love. Several women were dabbing at their eyes now. Clara's own vision blurred, and now, the Reverend smiled, now they gift us with the continuation of that miracle. New life, new hope, new proof that God's grace works in ways we don't expect. Let us thank Him for the Turner family and the lesson they teach us, that love isn't always where we start, but it's where we can choose to go. The prayer that followed was brief but heartfelt. as the final amen echoed. Samuel broke free from the group of children and ran to his parents, arms outstretched. "Home?" he asked hopefully. "Go home?" Elias lifted him up, settling him against his shoulder where the boy immediately nestled, thumb in mouth. "Yes, son. Let's go home." They made their farewells, promising to visit again soon, accepting one more round of congratulations and advice. As the wagon rolled out of town, Clara leaned against Elias's side, Samuel sleeping between them. "That went well," she said softly. "Better than well." He shifted the reins to one hand, wrapping his free arm around her. "You did it, Clara. Made us belong. We did it," she corrected. Together. The journey home was peaceful, Samuel waking only once to be fed and changed before sleeping again. The moon rose full and bright, turning the mountain path to silver. When they finally crested the last rise and saw their cabin below, windows dark but welcoming, Clara sighed with contentment. "There it is," she murmured. "Home." Elias helped her down from the wagon, hands lingering on her waist. "Thank you," he said suddenly. "For what?" "For answering that advertisement, for being stubborn enough to stay, for seeing something in me worth saving." He cupped her face gently. "For our son, for this new baby, for teaching me about grace." She rose on her toes to kiss him, soft and sweet in the moonlight. "You gave as much as you received. Elias Turner, never doubt that." They unloaded quietly, mindful of Samuel's sleep. As Elias tended the horses, Clara lit the lamps and stoked the banked fire back to life. Soon the cabin was warm and bright, filled with the familiar smells of wood smoke and the dried herbs hanging from the rafters. Clara was heating milk for Coco when Elias came in, bringing the last of their festival purchases. He found her standing by the window, one hand on her stomach, looking out at the star-filled sky. "Penny for your thoughts?" She smiled without turning. "Just thinking how different it all is from that first night. I was so frightened, so certain you'd send me away come morning, and now—" "And now you're stuck with me," he finished, wrapping his arms around her from behind, hands coming to rest over hers on the gentle swell of their growing child. "Happily stuck," she agreed, leaning back against him. "Permanently stuck." Samuel stirred in his cradle, the same one Elias had carved, now awaiting its next occupant. They moved together to check on him, adjusting his blanket, smoothing his dark hair so like his mother's. "He'll be a good big brother," Clara whispered. "The best," Elias agreed. "We'll teach him. Together." They stood there in the lamplight, watching their son sleep, dreaming of the child to come, wrapped in the quiet contentment of a life rebuilt from sorrow. Outside, the wind sang through the pines, and the mountains stood eternal guard. But inside, in their cabin that had become a home, all was warmth and peace and the particular grace that comes from choosing love, day after day, until choice becomes devotion and devotion becomes forever. "I love you," Clara said, the words still fresh enough to send warmth through him every time. "And I love you," he replied, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "Both of you, all of you, always." She smiled, that transformative smile that had first cracked his frozen heart. "That's all I need to know." And it was. In their mountain cabin, far from the world's noise and judgment, they had found everything: purpose, peace, partnership, and the promise of all the years to come. They had found family. They had found home. They had found grace. Most of all, they had found each other. Thank you for listening to our story today. I'd love to know where you're enjoying this tale. Are you listening during your commute, relaxing at home, or perhaps on a long drive? Please subscribe to From Wild West channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Your stories and connections make our community special.